If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten legends to life. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, a small frontier town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. It was the summer of 1873, and the heat seemed to rise from the very earth itself, creating shimmering mirages that danced above the weathered wooden buildings. Dr. Samuel Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of his modest clinic, a converted general store that served as the town's only medical facility. The 40-year-old physician had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years prior, carrying nothing but his medical bag and a determination to help those who couldn't afford city doctors. Born in Boston to a wealthy family of merchants, Samuel had attended Harvard Medical School and could have established a lucrative practice among the city's elite. But the death of his younger brother from tuberculosis and the inability of expensive doctors to save him had changed his perspective forever. The town bustled with its usual afternoon activity. Cowboys tied their horses to hitching posts outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, their spurs jingling against the wooden sidewalks. Women in long dresses hurried between shops, shielding themselves from the relentless sun with colorful parasols. Children chased each other through the dusty streets. The general store, owned by the portly German immigrant Heinrich Weber, displayed its wares on the covered porch. Sacks of flour and beans sat alongside farming tools and bolts of colorful fabric. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm as he shaped horseshoes on his anvil. But beyond the town's edge, where the desert met the foothills, lived someone the townspeople had chosen to forget. 3 miles north, in a small adobe hut surrounded by wild sage and desert flowers, resided Maria Cielo, an elderly Navajo woman who had once been the region's most sought-after healer. Years ago, before Dr. Hayes arrived, Maria had been the one people turned to when modern medicine failed. Her knowledge of herbs, her gentle touch, and her spiritual wisdom had saved countless lives. She had learned her craft from her grandmother, who had learned from hers, in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. The old woman remembered when the first settlers arrived, dusty and desperate after crossing the harsh desert. She had welcomed them, sharing her knowledge of which plants provided water, which berries were safe to eat, and how to treat the strange new diseases that seemed to follow the white men wherever they went. But as the town grew and prejudices hardened, the white settlers began to view her practices with suspicion and fear. They called her methods witchcraft, her remedies dangerous superstitions. The territorial government passed laws restricting native healing practices, and Maria found herself increasingly isolated. The turning point came during the cholera outbreak of 1868. While the townspeople buried their dead and prayed for deliverance, Maria worked tirelessly in the Mexican quarter, using her herbal remedies to save dozens of lives. But instead of gratitude, she faced accusations of spreading the disease herself. Now, at 72 years old, Maria lived in isolation. Her weathered hands, once steady as they prepared healing tinctures, now trembled with age and illness. Her dark eyes, which had once sparkled with ancient wisdom, were clouded with cataracts that made her nearly blind. Her small dwelling reflected decades of neglect and poverty. The roof leaked during the monsoon rains, and she had to place clay pots throughout the single room to catch the water. The walls, once painted bright blue, had faded to a dusty grey. Her few possessions were carefully arranged on wooden shelves her late husband had built. Dr. Hayes had heard whispers about the old woman from his Mexican patients, who still spoke of her with reverence. They told him stories of impossible recoveries, of children pulled back from death's door, of wounds that healed without scarring. Rosa Mendoza, the baker's wife, claimed Maria had saved her son from snakebite when he was just 5 years old. But whenever he asked the white townsfolk about her, they would change the subject or simply shrug. Mayor Johnstone, a pompous man with political aspirations, had once warned the doctor that associating with Indian healers could damage his reputation and practice. On this particular afternoon, as the heat reached its peak, a young Apache boy named Running Fox burst through the doctor's door. His chest heaved with exhaustion, and his dark eyes were wide with desperation. The boy had ridden hard for 2 hours across the desert, his horse now lathered with sweat and foam. The boy spoke no English, but his gestures were clear. Someone needed help, urgently. He pointed toward the desert, made signs indicating an old woman, and clasped his hands together in prayer. Dr. Hayes had learned enough Spanish and sign language during his frontier years to understand the basic message. Dr. Hayes grabbed his medical bag, checking to ensure he had adequate supplies of laudanum, quinine, and carbolic acid. He also packed extra bandages and his surgical instruments, uncertain what he might encounter. The boy led him to a horse waiting outside, a sturdy Mustang that looked capable of covering rough terrain. They rode hard across the desert, the horse's hooves kicking up clouds of red dust that painted the sky behind them. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with towering saguaro cacti, prickly pear, and scrub brush that had adapted to survive in this harsh environment. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Roadrunners darted between the cacti, and high overhead, turkey vultures circled lazily on the thermal currents rising from the heated earth. As they approached the small adobe dwelling, Dr. Hayes could see that it was in serious disrepair. The roof had several holes where tiles had fallen, and the walls were cracked from years of exposure to the brutal temperature changes between scorching days and cold desert nights. Wild vines had grown over parts of the structure, creating patches of green in the otherwise brown landscape. A small garden area showed evidence of cultivation, with rows of corn, beans, and squash struggling to survive in the harsh conditions. Ceramic pots collected precious rainwater from the occasional desert storms. Running Fox led him around to the back of the dwelling, where a small ramada provided shade for outdoor cooking. Clay pots and grinding stones were arranged on a low wooden table, and bundles of dried plants hung from the wooden support posts, filling the air with a complex mixture of earthy, medicinal scents. Inside the dim interior, Maria Cielo lay on a simple wooden bed covered with colorful woven blankets. Her granddaughter, Elena, knelt beside her, tears streaming down her young face. The old woman's skin was burning with fever, and her lips were cracked and dry from dehydration. Elena, perhaps 20 years old, wore a traditional Navajo dress of deep blue wool decorated with silver buttons. Her long black hair was braided with strips of leather, and turquoise earrings caught what little light filtered through the small windows. She looked up at the white doctor with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Dr. Hayes immediately began his examination. Maria's pulse was weak and irregular, and her breathing was increasingly difficult. Her temperature was dangerously high, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that he recognized as a sign of severe illness. Through Elena's broken English, supplemented by Spanish words she had learned from Mexican traders, he learned that the elderly healer had been sick for weeks, growing progressively worse. The family had no money for a doctor, and the townspeople had long since stopped visiting their isolated dwelling. Elena explained that her grandmother had been caring for a sick child from a neighboring Apache band when she herself fell ill. Despite her own deteriorating condition, Maria had continued preparing medicines for others, refusing to rest until she collapsed 3 days earlier. As he worked, Dr. Hayes noticed something remarkable about the small dwelling. Despite its poor condition, it was filled with carefully organized collections of dried herbs, roots, and medicinal plants. Glass jars lined makeshift shelves, each labeled in symbols he couldn't read, but suspected contained remedies passed down through generations. Bundles of sage, yarrow, and echinacea hung from the roof beams alongside plants he didn't recognize. Small leather pouches contained powdered bark and crushed berries. The organization was meticulous, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of botanical medicine that rivaled anything he had learned in medical school. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman who had spent her entire life healing others, now dying alone because the very people she had once saved had turned their backs on her. The injustice of it filled him with a quiet rage that he channeled into determination. Maria's condition was severe. She was suffering from pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and exhaustion. Her lungs were filled with fluid, and her body was fighting multiple infections simultaneously. In a city hospital, with proper equipment and resources, she might have had a chance. But here, in this remote desert dwelling with limited supplies, the prospects looked grim. Dr. Hayes had seen similar cases before, and he knew that without immediate intervention, the old woman would likely die within days, possibly hours. But Dr. Hayes refused to give up. He spent the next 3 days traveling back and forth between the town and Maria's home, bringing medicine, food, and clean water. Each trip took over an hour each way, but he persisted despite the questioning looks from townspeople. Heinrich Weber, the store owner, asked why he was purchasing so many supplies for the old Indian woman. Sheriff Morrison, a gruff man with grey whiskers, wondered aloud whether it was wise to waste resources on someone who probably wouldn't survive anyway. Dr. Hayes ignored their comments, focusing instead on his patient's needs. He brought fresh vegetables and broth to combat the malnutrition, clean bandages and carbolic acid to prevent secondary infections, and laudanum to ease her pain and help her rest. Each night he would sit by Maria's bedside, monitoring her breathing and temperature. Elena would prepare traditional teas from her grandmother's collection of herbs, creating complex mixtures that seemed to have properties he couldn't quite understand but couldn't deny were effective. The young woman showed him how to prepare willow bark tea for fever, echinacea for infection, and a complex mixture of desert plants that seemed to clear the congestion in Maria's lungs. Together, they created a unique blend of modern medicine and ancient healing practices. On the third night, Eleanor shared more of her grandmother's story. Maria had been married to a Navajo warrior named Joseph Cielo, who had died fighting alongside Kit Carson during the Indian Wars. She had raised 5 children alone, lost 3 to disease and violence, and had devoted her life to preventing such losses in others. The young woman's eyes filled with tears as she described how her grandmother had taught her the old ways, passing down knowledge that stretched back countless generations. Elena had planned to become a healer herself, but the changing times made such dreams seem impossible. On the 4th night, as a violent thunderstorm raged across the desert, Maria's fever finally broke. Lightning illuminated the small dwelling in brilliant flashes, and thunder rolled across the mountains like the voices of ancient spirits. Rain drummed against the adobe walls, bringing the sweet scent of wet earth. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in weeks, she spoke. Her voice was weak but clear, and she looked directly at Dr. Hayes with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Despite her physical frailty, there was an unmistakable strength in her gaze. Elena translated her grandmother's words with trembling excitement. The old woman wanted to know why a white doctor had come to save her when her own people had abandoned her. She had expected to die alone, forgotten by the world that had once sought her healing touch. Dr. Hayes struggled to find the right words, finally settling on a simple truth that Elena conveyed in their native tongue. He told her that a healer's duty was to help anyone in need, regardless of their race, wealth, or social standing. Medicine, he believed, should be colorblind. Maria listened carefully, then reached out with a trembling hand to touch the doctor's face. Her fingers traced the lines of worry and exhaustion that had deepened during her illness. She spoke again, and Elena translated with wonder in her voice. The old woman said she could see goodness in his spirit, a quality that couldn't be taught in medical schools. She had sensed his presence even during her deepest fever dreams, and somehow knew that he was different from the other white men who had come to their land. As Maria's strength slowly returned over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Word spread through the Mexican and Native American communities that the old healer was recovering, saved by the white doctor who had refused to abandon her. But more than that, people began to notice that Dr. Hayes had incorporated some of Maria's traditional remedies into his own practice, with remarkable results. Patients who had struggled with chronic conditions suddenly found relief through combinations of modern medicine and ancient herbal treatments. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, had suffered from severe headaches for years. No medicine from back east had provided relief, but a tea made from desert willow bark, combined with proper rest and nutrition, finally gave her peace. She spread word of the cure throughout the women's church circle. Young Tommy Martinez had developed a persistent cough that threatened to become tuberculosis. Dr. Hayes treated him with both modern chest therapy and an indigenous remedy made from desert sage and honey. The boy recovered completely, much to his mother's joy and the amazement of the townspeople. The transformation wasn't just medical. As Maria recovered, she began teaching Dr. Hayes about the healing properties of desert plants, while he shared his knowledge of anatomy and disease. Two different worlds of medicine began to merge, creating something more powerful than either could achieve alone. She showed him how to identify medicinal plants by their leaves, flowers, and even their scent. He learned that certain cacti could provide emergency water, that specific berries could treat digestive problems, and that the bark of particular trees contained natural painkillers. In return, Dr. Hayes explained how infections spread, why cleanliness prevented disease, and how proper nutrition supported the body's natural healing processes. Maria absorbed this information eagerly, integrating it with her existing knowledge to create new and more effective treatments. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge began to take notice. Some came out of curiosity, others out of genuine medical need. They found an unlikely partnership between the educated city doctor and the indigenous healer, working together to serve anyone who needed help. Mayor Johnstone initially opposed this development, fearing it would damage the town's reputation among potential investors and settlers. But when his own daughter fell seriously ill with scarlet fever, and the combination of modern medicine and traditional remedies saved her life, his attitude changed dramatically. Maria's small adobe home became a second clinic where people could receive treatment that addressed not just their physical ailments, but their spiritual and emotional needs as well. The old woman's gentle wisdom complemented the doctor's scientific knowledge, creating a healing environment unlike anything the frontier had seen. Patients would often leave with both prescription medicines and small pouches of herbal remedies. Dr. Hayes learned to listen not just to physical symptoms, but to the stories behind them, understanding how grief, fear, and spiritual distress could manifest as bodily illness. Elena proved to be an invaluable translator and assistant, helping bridge the communication gap between cultures and languages. She began learning medical terminology in English while teaching Dr. Hayes basic words in Navajo and Apache, creating a unique trilingual medical vocabulary. Months passed, and the partnership between Dr. Hayes and Maria Cielo became legendary throughout the territory. People traveled from hundreds of miles away to receive treatment from the unlikely duo, bringing prosperity and recognition to the once-forgotten region. The territorial governor himself made a special trip to Cedar Ridge to witness this unusual medical collaboration. He left impressed not only by the innovative treatments, but by the harmony between different cultures that had been achieved in this remote desert community. Newspaper reporters from Denver and Santa Fe wrote articles about the miracle of Cedar Ridge, describing how an educated Eastern doctor and an indigenous healer had created a new model for frontier medicine. These articles brought even more visitors and recognition to the area, but perhaps the most remarkable change was in Cedar Ridge itself. The town that had once turned its back on Maria now celebrated her as a treasure. Children who had been taught to fear her now sat at her feet, listening to stories of healing and wisdom passed down through generations. She would tell them about the spirits that lived in the desert plants, the proper way to harvest medicines without harming the ecosystem, and the importance of treating illness as an imbalance that affected the whole person, not just individual symptoms. The local school board, initially resistant, eventually invited Maria to teach the children about desert survival and natural medicine. These lessons proved invaluable when several children became lost during a flash flood and were able to survive using the knowledge she had shared. Dr. Hayes watched this transformation with deep satisfaction. He had come to the frontier to practice medicine, but he had discovered something far more valuable. In saving Maria's life, he had learned that true healing went beyond pills and procedures. His own practice evolved as well. He began spending more time with patients, listening to their concerns and fears. He learned to see illness not as isolated medical problems, but as part of complex webs of social, spiritual, and environmental factors. The combination of approaches proved remarkably effective. Surgical success rates improved when patients were prepared with traditional calming ceremonies. Chronic conditions responded better when treated with both modern medicines and lifestyle changes based on indigenous wisdom. As word of their success spread, other doctors began visiting Cedar Ridge to learn their methods. Some were skeptical initially, but the undeniable results convinced even the most traditional practitioners that there was value in combining different healing approaches. Medical schools back east began documenting their techniques, and Dr. Hayes was invited to lecture at his alma mater about frontier medicine. He always insisted that Maria receive equal recognition for their innovations, though she preferred to remain in the desert she loved. The partnership faced challenges as well. Some territorial officials questioned the legality of allowing unlicensed native healers to practice medicine. Dr. Hayes fought these bureaucratic battles, arguing that Maria's knowledge was too valuable to suppress for arbitrary legal reasons. There were also cultural misunderstandings and occasional conflicts between patients from different backgrounds. But Maria's gentle wisdom and Dr. Hayes's diplomatic skills usually managed to resolve these issues, often turning conflicts into opportunities for greater understanding. The old healer lived for many more years, working alongside Dr. Hayes until her peaceful death at the age of 87. Her knowledge was preserved not just in the herbs and remedies she had collected, but in the hearts and minds of those she had taught. Elena eventually became a certified nurse, combining her grandmother's traditional knowledge with formal medical training. She established a school for indigenous healing practices that attracted students from across the Southwest, ensuring that ancient wisdom would not be lost. Dr. Hayes continued practicing in Cedar Ridge until his retirement, never returning to the comfortable Boston life he had left behind. He often said that saving Maria's life had taught him more about medicine than all his years of formal education combined. The story of their partnership became a legend told around campfires and in saloons throughout the West. It was a tale of how compassion could overcome prejudice, how different cultures could learn from each other, and how sometimes the greatest miracles came not from medical procedures, but from simple human kindness. Their clinic treated thousands of patients over the years, earning a reputation that extended far beyond the territorial boundaries. People spoke of miraculous cures, of hopeless cases that turned around, of a place where healing encompassed both body and spirit. Today, visitors to the area can still see the remains of Maria's adobe home. now marked with a small plaque commemorating the indigenous healer who refused to be forgotten. And in the town of Cedar Ridge, now a thriving community, there stands a medical clinic that bears both their names. The Maria Cielo Samuel Hayes Medical Center continues their tradition of combining different healing approaches, serving patients from all backgrounds with the same compassion and innovation that characterized their original partnership. Medical students from around the world come to study their integrated approach to healthcare. What do you think was the most important lesson Dr. Hayes learned from Maria Cielo? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you believe makes a true healer in today's world.